Thank you for joining us. As Kat mentioned, I am the curator of our current exhibition entitled Book of Marvels, Imagining the Medieval World, which is on view at the Morgan until May 25th. Before we begin, I'd like to share a brief overview of the exhibition for those who haven't had a chance to see it yet. I should also add that you can visit the exhibition virtually on the museum's webpage, where you can find images of all the objects in the show, as well as all the labeled text. This exhibition focuses on a rare illustrated guide to the globe that describes the remarkable inhabitants, customs, and natural phenomena of 56 regions around the world. The text, which survives in only 4 copies, was written in France in the early 15th century by an unidentified author who scoured ancient and medieval sources for the most unusual, shocking, and unbelievable anecdotes of places both near and far. Tales ranging from incredible accounts of cannibalism, human sacrifice, giant snails, and dragons, to more mundane marvels like flames that can't be extinguished or water that never boils. These compelling but mostly fictitious accounts were intended both to educate and titillate medieval readers. The charming miniature paintings accompanying each location translate the stories into vibrant visual compositions that were readily appealing. At left, for example, you see an image of Arabia, a land said to be rich in precious gems that the locals cut from the stomachs of dragons, just as pearls are removed from oysters. At bottom center is Thrace, in modern-day Balkans, whose inhabitants are referred to as barbarians who kill indiscriminately, mourn the birth of their children, and dance at funerals. And at upper right is Trapane, or modern-day Sri Lanka, whose inhabitants were said to hunt giant snails and make homes out of their shells. These miniatures can be seen in the exhibition in 2 splendid and closely related copies of the Book of Marvels from the collections of the Morgan Library and the J. Paul Getty Museum in Los Angeles. The exhibition situates the Book of Marvels in the broader context of medieval visualizations of the world and its inhabitants, focusing on illuminated encyclopedias, travel writing, and medieval maps. Visitors to these related objects allow visitors to experience how people in the Middle Ages used the concept of marvels as a way of understanding their world. The encyclopedias on view demonstrate how medieval knowledge of the world was based not on empirical observations, but rather the authority of ancient writers, whose texts were the main source for the stories recounted in the Book of Marvels. Their visual programs likewise served as an important model for the artists of the Marvels manuscripts. Here, for example, you're seeing images of China from a 15th century Flemish encyclopedia at left, and the harvesting of cinnamon in Arabia from a 12th century English book of beasts, both on view in the exhibition. The 2 most famous travel accounts of the period, that of Marco Polo and John Mandeville, demonstrate how the genre was a main source for encountering marvels and foreign cultures in the Middle Ages. Illuminated copies of Mandeville's text lavish particular attention on representative pairs of men and women from regions around the world. In the exhibition, you can see the example of the Chaldeans from modern-day Iraq. According to the text, the men of this region are renowned for their beauty and their sense of fashion, in contrast to the women, who are, let us just say, challenged in both respects. A major highlight of the exhibition is the prominent display of 3 of the most spectacular medieval maps from the Morgan's collection. These exceedingly rare objects from the 13th, 14th, and 15th centuries allow visitors to see firsthand how medieval Europeans viewed their world. QR codes link visitors to digital versions of each map, which have been labeled in English. And you could browse these online too. Another running thread in the exhibition is the display of manuscripts that engage the theme from non-European perspectives. I felt that it was particularly important to do this not only to balance the overwhelming Eurocentrism of the Book of Marvels itself, but also to demonstrate that the various traditions it draws on were deeply cross-cultural. In the exhibition, you can see a spectacular Ottoman Book of Wonders, a Persian encyclopedia, and the story of Alexander the Great as told by the poet Nizami. The show ends with a brief coda devoted to the legacy of marvels, demonstrating how the assumption of a world full of marvels inevitably shaped European perceptions of other cultures in a time when increased travel, trade, and colonial expansion meant that medieval expectations were increasingly being confronted with the realities of global encounters. Throughout the exhibition, visitors can see how foreign cultures were imagined in the Middle Ages and what medieval European assumptions about others say about their own implicit biases and beliefs. Ultimately, the exhibition demonstrates how the Book of Marvels tells us much more about the people doing the marveling than about the wondrous things themselves. And I'm happy to acknowledge the generous support that made this exhibition possible from the New York Medieval Society, an anonymous donor, the Lucy Ricciardi Family Exhibition Fund, Martha J. Fleischman, the David L. Klein Foundation, and the Samuel H. Kress Foundation. So the topic of today's program picks up on one of the threads in this exhibition by bringing into dialogue parallel traditions of imagining the world in medieval European and Islamic manuscripts. I'm so pleased that we're joined today by two renowned experts on the subjects that I'll introduce now, and they'll give their presentations one after the other, and then please drop your questions into the chat, and we'll do a question and answer session after the second presentation. So our first speaker is Asa Simon Mittman, who is professor of art and art history at California State University, Chico. He's written many books and articles on monstrosity and marginality in the Middle Ages, including pieces on Satan, race, and anti-Semitism in the Middle Ages. His most recent book is Cartographies of Exclusion, Anti-Semitic Mapping in Medieval England, and his collaborative cross-cultural study of medieval Jewish, Christian, Islamicate, and Chinese maps is under contract with Cambridge University Press. Our second speaker today is Professor Travis Zadeh, chair of the Department of Religious Studies at Yale University, where he teaches and writes on Islamic intellectual and cultural history. His work focuses on the connected histories of science, magic, and religion. He has written widely on Arabic and Persian geographies and cosmographies, and his latest book, Wonders and Rarities, the marvelous book that traveled the world and mapped the cosmos with Harvard University Press, offers an evocative account of wonder, nature, and empire by tracking the many afterlives of an Arabic compendium of natural history written in the wake of the Mongol conquests. Okay, so with that, I will turn it over to Asa.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you, Josh. Thanks to Morgan for having me. And I look forward to Travis's talk, which we'll get to hear shortly. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk a little bit about imagining the medieval world in the most literal sense. So I'm going to look at a couple of maps of the world and think about how those indicate how medieval groups viewed the world. I'm going to be focusing on European Christian imagery, but I'm going to look at also an Islamic world map for some comparison to see a very different framing of the world. And then I'm going to think about how the notion of wonder itself, which Josh alluded to in his introduction, how the notion of wonder framed a lot of the ways that medieval people engaged with the phenomena around them and the phenomena that they envisioned being in very distant locations. And then we'll look in detail at this spectacular image, which is on the screen right now. So these are two medieval Christian world maps. The very simple seeming one on the right is what's called a TO map. There's literally an O with a T inscribed in the middle of it. But that may also be a reference to the section of the book that it attends, which is to say Isidore's Etymologies, which was a sort of encyclopedia from the early Middle Ages, written by Isidore, who was a Spanish bishop. And this section describes the orbis terrarum, that is to say, the orb of the earth. And so the O with the T inside may pertain both to its form and to its content. And then across from it, the much more ornate and spectacular one is a tiny map. It's only about 3 inches across, that is actually organizing the world around the same general principles, but adds a great deal more to it. And that is a type that's often referred to as a mappa mundi, which is literally a Latin term meaning cloth of the world, napkin of the world. Mappa originally does not reference the content of a map, but rather the material support it sat upon. But by the end of the Middle Ages, it seems that mappa does start to mean what we think of as a map, which is to say a representation of geography in some way. Now, the way the world is organized on the TO map is the same as the way it is organized on this Mappa Mundi. which is to say that they considered the world to have three land masses, Asia, Europe, and Africa. These are the three that are accounted for in the Bible. They considered Asia to be the largest and most important of those places, which strikes a lot of modern viewers as surprising, but this makes sense when we bear in mind a biblical worldview. Both of these maps were made in England. What portion of the Bible is set in England? None. So the vast majority of the things that happen in the Bible are set in what they thought of as Asia, which is everything on this map from Jerusalem at the center to the Garden of Eden at the apex. So these are all oriented toward the Orient, that is to say, they face east. And so Asia is in the literally superior position. Superior is a Latin term that means above. Inferior is a Latin term that means below. So that which is above is placed in the superior position and is also twice as large. So Asia is given pride of place here. Europe and Africa split the lower half of the map. Now, if we look just for a brief comparison at a fairly popular type of medieval Islamic world map, we can see that the world is organized, first off, in quite a different way, which is to say it is organized with south at the top. And this is a version of it produced by Karen Pinto that helps us if we do not read Arabic. So you can see that Africa sits at the top, and we get the full span of it all the way down to the tip, and I'll show you on the Christian map that it's rather more abbreviated. The Mediterranean way over on the right side, and Europe, a very small and kind of vestigial organ down here in a corner, suggesting a worldview where Asia and Africa are deeply interconnected and tied across a main body of water that's the Indian Ocean, as opposed to a European view, which gives pride of place to the Mediterranean. Now, if we compare these, I've turned the Christian map on its side so that they're both facing south. The section that I've circled in green here, that's about what is covered on this Christian map, which is to say it looks at the Mediterranean, Europe, Western Asia, and North Africa. So it is a much more abridged version of the world that centers very much Jerusalem as a conceptual and religious heart of the world, and then sees the main connective tissues between the world really being a kind of Mediterranean world rather than an Indian Ocean focused world. Whereas the Islamic map suggests much more ties between the Western Asia or Middle East and all of Africa. Okay, so I'm going to focus in now on this one more closely. So this was made in Britain around the middle of the 13th century and was almost certainly made for a royal patron and was owned by royalty, the King of England or somebody in his immediate family. So that means it wouldn't have been seen by a lot of people, but the people who it would have been seen by were among the most powerful people in the kingdom. It has Britain included way down in that bottom corner, sort of squished in at the very edge of the world. Very important part of how the medieval English viewed themselves as a people way off on the edge of the sphere of the world. And it centers, as I mentioned, Jerusalem, and at the apex we have the Garden of Eden, in which you can see two figures on either side of a tree. So this is Adam and Eve staring at the fruit which appears on that tree and contemplating committing the first sin according to the biblical narrative. Now that tells us one other important thing about the way these maps work, which is that they chart time as well as space. They include historical activities and events as well as including geographical events. And so, for example, this slash of sort of orange that's coming in, This is the Red Sea, which is presented as red, not because medieval people thought the Red Sea was literally red, but as a sort of mnemonic way of pointing to it, the same way that we represent our rivers as blue, though, of course, if you look at most rivers, they're really not. Um, but that gap in it, that break that this red arrow is pointing to, that represents the crossing of the Red Sea by the Israelites in the biblical narrative, leaving Egypt, which is to the right of the Red Sea, and heading on their way toward ultimately Jerusalem at its center. Okay, we have Jerusalem as a holy center of the world, but at its apex, above the circle of the earth itself, we have an image of Christ with the cross nimbus halo, and he holds in his hand another version of this same map, recognizable from that TO map format that I showed you just before. So we have an image that Christ is both rising out of the world and holds the whole thing in his hand. In a way, I've always found it oddly casual. He's just sort of, you know, holding it off kilter to the side as if it seems, a fairly insignificant thing to him. He stares out at us, raises his hand in blessing. So, earth in the center, Christ above, and then down at the bottom, we have a pair of dragons, perhaps suggesting a kind of heaven, earth, and hell dynamic. Now, geography was of paramount importance in the Middle Ages, and this pertains to the books of Wonders and Marvels that form the heart of this exhibition, as well as to maps themselves, because medieval Christians viewed the earth as divinely ordained and laid out in order to teach things to people. St. Augustine, who is one of the most important figures in early Christianity, really is responsible for a lot of the sort of architecture of Christianity. He wrote, "The circle of the earth is our great book. In it I read the perfection which is promised in the book of God." And so by calling it our great book and referencing the book of God, what he's saying is you can read the earth the same way you read the Bible. You can look at elements of the world and see within it elements of God's divine plan and what he is trying, presumably, they would argue, to teach people in order to arrive at the top in heaven rather than down in the bottom with the dragons. Now, there's the quote. Sorry about that. If we look at the right edge, which is the southernmost extent of Africa that appears on the map, we see a whole collection of peoples. Now, I've labeled them all. I'm not going to go through them all. They are all wondrous beings, but these come from a common set of wondrous beings that appear in a whole lot of different texts, which have ancient roots, which appear commonly in the Islamic world. They also appear in medieval Chinese sources, medieval Japanese sources. They are a very common and popular set. And what they provide are a whole lot of different and strange and wondrous or monstrous variants on humanity as it would have been understood by European Christian audiences for a work like this. Now, they are conceived of being way over there at the edge of the earth on the far side of the world. And so we get a kind of cluster of otherness. Now, what was the way for confronting such beings in the period? A lot of modern scholars, myself included, love to talk about monsters, but in the Middle Ages, they thought much more, it seems, about a concept of wonder, which is central to this current exhibition. There's a variety of medieval terms that are used to describe this. There's mirabile in Latin. There's wundor, the Old English word, which gives us the modern word wonder. Old French gives us merveille, and then that gets borrowed over into England as merveille, which gives us the modern marvel. So wonder and marvel are really major ways that medieval people confronted the world. And the thing I think is really important to bear in mind about these terms and what they mean is that they are interactions, they are responses. Nothing is inherently wondrous over off by itself. It is only in contact with someone looking at it that a thing becomes wondrous. How do you know something is a wonder? It evokes a sense of wonder. How do you know something is a marvel? It inspires us to marvel at it. And so these are inherently relational experiences. And that was the framework whereby they thought about beings like these. Um, Now, same St. Augustine um, tells us again that these are there to teach us things. He says, and to us, the puns work better in Latin, just trust me on that. And to us, the monsters, signs, portents, prodigies, as they are named, ought to demonstrate, ought to signify and portend and prophecy that God is going to do with the bodies of men what he foretold he was able to do with no difficulty to impede him, with no laws of nature dictating to him. And the specific thing he's talking about here, the thing that God said he would do, is the general resurrection at the end of time. People wondered, how could God put souls back into bodies when those bodies had rotted away over the years, been torn apart by wild animals, lost at sea, and so on? And Augustine's answer is God can do anything. And he shows us this through marvels, portents, monsters, wonders, prodigies, that these signs demonstrate this fact to us. Now, they divided wonders into two main categories. On the one hand, prodigal births, which are sort of one-off oddities. Here we have the late medieval, early Renaissance master printmaker Albert Durr's monstrous Sow of Lanzer. This was a pig that was born with two tongues and four ears and an extra hindquarters and extra legs growing out of its top. And this was such an exciting thing that one of the most prominent and well-regarded artists of his day made his way to Lanzar in order to view it himself in person and make an image of it. These were viewed as signs relating to something in particular occurring at the time often. But on the right of the screen, we see a trio of beings called pan-uti, which means like all-eared people. And they were people who had giant ears who we read use them at night to sleep in them, using one under them like a mattress and the other on top as a coverlet. And you can see the figure at the bottom curling himself up for that purpose. But the important thing about this is that we see them as Joshua Driscoll alluded to, a reproducing set of beings, not a one-off, not something that happened once, maybe by accident or maybe by the will of God, but a group that replicates itself. So we have here a mother and a father and a child, pan-oti. And so this is the other kind of wonder, these groups that are out there on the far edge of the world, like the ones that were on that Psalter map. Now, the terms they use to describe these in Latin, gens, natio, and gentis. In English, Middle English, mon, cun, or kinda. These all predate the modern term race, but that term's often been applied to them later and is largely applicable. And here we see a series of wild people, again, male, female, and baby. John Mandeville, as Josh mentioned, was an incredibly popular text in the Middle Ages, perhaps based on survivals, the most popular secular text of the whole Middle Ages. And it, in its account of the world and its wonders, also emphasizes this same thing, that these are, in essence, stable beings that reproduce themselves. And one of the ways that we can see that focus is by a surprising emphasis on the genitalia of these beings. Here we see a pair of cyclopses, male and female. Below them, we see blemmies, and then epiphagi, both peoples who have their faces either on the fronts or their backs and no heads. So all of those trends, all of those modes of thought, all of those ways of viewing the world are all condensed into one fabulous image here, which is only one of many that appear in the Book of Marvels of the World that's at the heart of this exhibition. This is a page purporting to show Ethiopia. So part of the same region that we were looking at on that map where all of those peoples lived. Now, there are wondrous creatures, a giant bird that may be a phoenix, a group of dragons, which may recall that one from the map. The dragon with a coxcomb on its head is a basilisk. That is a creature born of a chicken egg that can turn people to stone. But I tend to be more interested in the human-like beings or human variants. And so, for example, here coming out of a cave, we see a group that are called troglodytes, a term that survives into the modern world. And they are shown eating wild lizards, wearing rough animal skins for clothing, and living in caves. And the text will back up that that's what's going on here. This is the same being on the Psalter map, represented very differently. Just to the right of them, we have a wild man like the one I just showed you, who are wild people covered in hair who carry about clubs, which they use as weapons, who are both kind of romanticized and feared in equal measure in the period, sort of proto-Sasquatches. Um, Toward the center, my personal favorite of all wondrous peoples, are those headless people, those blemmies like the ones from John Mandeville. And again, we have an emphasis on the genitalia, which suggests that this is not just some oddity that happened once, but a type of person happening over there all the time. Now, each of these kinds of beings provides an element of difference from their European viewers. And so up in the top center of this image, up here, we see a group of men with long beards kneeling to worship a crowned dog, or possibly idol of a crowned dog. And for contrast, I show a related image from the Book of Mandeville showing not people worshiping dogs, but dog people worshiping a different sort of idol, a calf idol. And these were images that are probably intended as a demonization of Islamic religious practices through a wildly fantasized lens that sees Islam against all evidence as an idol worshiping group. Um, Over on the right edge, we have another one of those fabulous panoti with their giant ears. Again, thinking about these as replicating, reproducing groups. So what do we have? Stepping back in my last minute and 15 seconds. What we have, as on the map, is an image that contains within it a mass of difference, of otherness, of points of comparison for its European Christian viewer. Being by being, what these creatures are doing is constructing an image, but of course not one of Ethiopia, which bears none of these peoples and none of these beings and none of these features, but rather what they are doing is through contrast, through negation, building up an image of what they thought it meant to be a proper European Christian. Okay, kept right on to time.
Great. Thank you so much, Asa, for that deep dive into this incredible imagery. And with that, we'll turn it over to Travis. I think you're still on mute.
Thank you so much. I'm
There we
just
go.
pulling up the slides, and I think you can see them now. Okay, is that right? They're up and
Yes.
running. So thank
Great.
you, Josh, for inviting me, and it's a real honor to be part of this conversation. And congratulations on this exciting, really wonderful exhibition. And it's truly also just a privilege to be in conversation here with Asa as well. And I'm going to just pick up on many of the same themes that we've been traveling through, but focusing in on patterns of exchange with Islamic materials, European and Islamic materials. The theme of maps, of course, is something that we've already seen, and I'm going to speak a little bit about both maps and marvelous creatures and encounters that we can trace through these materials. So this is an image of the Catalan map, a very famous map produced in Mallorca in the 1400s, and it in its own right kind of represents this Mediterranean space of Christians, Jews, and Muslims coming together in various ways. This was itself produced in a workshop of a famous Jewish map maker. And if we zoom in on one of the images within the map, which is populated with strange creatures here, we have a famous story, and so this is just one of the examples of the oddities that we just saw in Asa's talk, zoomed in closely, and that's the story of small-statured people here in China who are fighting off cranes. And I just wanted to zoom in on this because it's a nice example of how mobile these accounts and these anecdotes truly are and were over time. We got a sense of that in the earlier presentation here. Of course, in the Book of Marvels, that's right now on exhibition at the Morgan, we have a similar story of small-statured people battling cranes. They're so tiny they fend them off. And again, we also have this going way back into antiquity with a mural. We can see similar kinds of motifs in Pompeii, a mural of pygmies battling creatures. Here they're set in the Nile. This is an account that circulates in the classical sources in Herodotus and Pliny, certainly. We also get it in Aristotle. And it's through this classical body of accounts that we find the same kinds of materials making their way into Arabic and Islamic sources. So this is natural history produced in Iraq by a judge and a jurist named Qazvini. He writes it in the middle of the 1200s. And here we have that same story of small-statured people battling cranes as in their migratory patterns. And so this kind of mobility is something worth noting because we have strange stories moving all around, but they're internalized and repurposed and redeployed in notable ways. So the pygmies here, as they're known in the classical and antique sources, are part of a larger script, something that we've already heard outlined nicely in the previous presentation, of ways of thinking about the world in marvelous terms and thinking about difference in marvelous terms. And I wanted to just zoom in here on a slide. This is a slide that Carolyn Walker Bynum made famous in a 1997 article on wonder. It comes out of the very accounts that we've been seeing here of John Mandeville and his book, his accounts of wonder, very popular work. And this is a scene depicting the exchange of barnacle geese that grow on trees with the vegetal lamb. And it's literally, you can take a look at the dress of the men represented here of a representation of West meets East, where marvels are interchangeable and intelligible to each other. So you have Western men exchanging with Eastern men there on the right, comparable marvels. And that, as an emblem, it's a nice way of illustrating these models of exchange. So here we have, just to go back to the headless, the people without heads, which we get in Marco Polo in the East, a story that has its roots in Pliny and Herodotus and these classical sources. We have a comparable account here again in Qazwini of people, in this case in Java, with chests for heads, and doing similar kinds of work both in book culture and also in the narratives themselves that are being told around them. So this intelligibility also makes its way onto maps, and this is a nice example of it in the Islamic context of a later map produced in the Ottoman court by Piri Reis, who was himself an admiral in the Ottoman Navy, very much occupied in both the East and the Mediterranean. And you can see an example of this headless creature here located in this case on Brazil. So if we just zoom out, this is a map of the New World. So this is actually a very common paradigm that we find in early modern European maps that we also encounter in Islamic maps of the New World, of locating these strange creatures in ever-shifting horizons on the edges of the inhabitable Earth. So just to go back there, this would be in Brazil on this map. And this map is another wonderful testament to these modes of exchange, many of which are taking place in the Mediterranean, of cartographic material, but also of literary and philosophical accounts between Christians, Muslims, and Jews, and populated with all forms of wonder and rarity in the littoral spaces and in the oceans themselves. If we zoom in into the ocean, we have another story that circulated quite widely. It goes back again to antiquity and Greek and Latin, makes its way into Arabic, moves across all the European vernaculars. And that's the story of sailors who alighted onto an island and set a fire, only to realize that island was itself a giant sea creature that then plunges down into the depths of the sea below, startling everyone around. So we have that in this nice Ottoman map. And of course, it circulates widely in European traditions, as well, as you see here, a giant sea creature mistaken for an island in this Latin bestiary from the 14th century. So these patterns of exchange and representation do represent, in very clear senses, a script that is legible and indeed opens up actual exchanges that are taking place amongst Christians, Muslims, and Jews in this shared space of commerce at an elite level of representation and discourse. Perhaps the most notable paradigm for this, someone that we've heard alluded to already, is that of Alexander the Great. His stories circulate widely in a whole set of languages and cultural zones of contact. I could see on on one of the Mappa Mundi, enclosed that Asa shared with us, the enclosed peoples of Gog and Magog, who are very much part of the eschatological discourse shared by Christian, Muslims, and Jews. And here in the Alexander Romance, he is named as being responsible for bottling them up. And we get a nice representation of this in the 15th century in France, in an illustrated version of the Alexander Romance. Again, this circulates widely in an Islamic context. Iskander, as he's known, in Ferdowsi in the Book of Kings, and in Persian and Arabic, also is accredited with building a wall against Gog and Magog. And here you have them represented in very shaggy, hairy forms, as in the previous image, they're naked, demonstrating their kind of semi-barbarous state. In the Alexander Romance of Ferdowsi, the illustration here produced in the middle of the 1300s, we have them as kind of hairy, subhuman creatures. They're bottled up by this world-conquering king. Now, this is an image that comes out of a manuscript on view right now at the Morgan as part of the exhibition, and that's Sharmadon's Encyclopedia of Natural History. And we get an account of merchants in close contact with Gog and Magog, these literally savages at the edges of the earth. And I just wanted to focus in on this emotive quality here, because while these scripts are very shared of how to represent and think about difference and otherness, there's also some notable divergences. And this finger of astonishment is a key element in Persian discourses. You notice there's a finger that one of the merchants is holding up to his mouth. It's this finger in Persian referred to as angushte ta'ajub, the finger of bewilderment or perplexity or astonishment. And it's a visual way, an embodied way of attesting to and enacting forms of wonderment and marveling at the strange and uncanny. Not only are merchants accredited with this in this visual repertoire, but so too as Alexander the Great. This is also from the Morgan's collection, from Nizami's quintet of a 17th century image, where we see Alexander the Great contemplating, looking at the cave of Khosrow, whose fire never extinguishes, one of those themes that we've already encountered. There's a fire coming out of his tomb that never extinguishes, and Alexander the Great, as part of his conquering across the globe, is encountering it in this state of bewilderment and estrangement and curiosity and wonder, there with embodied physically with the finger to his mouth in perplexity. Now, as we move across time and place, we also not only have this paradigm of Alexander as a emperor, a ruler who engages with the world in forms of not only conquest, but accounting and collecting. And that paradigm becomes important for a whole set of rulers. And it's interesting to note that we're not only at an elite level of discourse here, but often we're intersecting with imperial forms of bookmaking, book collecting, and cartography and cosmology. And the Book of Felicity, that's also forms part of the exhibition at the Morgan right now, is a wonderful example of this. And it intersects in notable ways with a whole set of themes that we've been exploring. That Book of Felicity was commissioned by Sultan Murad III at the end of the 16th century, so we're in this early modern period. But many of the classical modes that we've been highlighting endure on these medieval paradigms that exist in Persian, Arabic, and Greek in the Latin West. And here he's holding the book itself that he's being presented. It's a fascinating book in its own right. It was produced by a courtier named Saudi, and the book is actually filled with, it's a kind of book of bibliomancy filled with divination and talismans, and also wondrous and curious stories. We have a parallel book too produced also for Sultan Murad II. It's the same copy, a second version, I should say, that's preserved in Paris. And here we can get a little bit more detail on the Sultan looking at the book itself that he's holding. And the image, you can actually see the image of the book there. That is the book itself, we, the readers, are looking at, is filled with astrological figures, part of its larger divinatory form. Now, as you kind of move into the stories, we have stories of Alexander the Great traveling through the land of darkness. Here he's with a companion who's illuminating the way, and they're encountering a world of wonder, but also a world that has potential talismanic and efficacious medicinal magical properties that could be uncovered and harnessed, and that is indeed part of the interest in exchange far-off lands is actual mercantile exchanges for medicaments and rarities that could have a whole set of therapeutic and magical ends to be used for. We get the account of Gog and Magog that has a talismanic dimension to it here. And indeed, there's talismans. These are kind of automata that are protecting the wall of Gog and Magog. And if you look there, you can see them crawling, trying to crawl up the wall to escape. And then we also get as well a whole set of talismanic representations of demons and jinn being another way of thinking about demonic forces, that in Islamic context could be both believing jinn or unbelieving jinn, which is interesting that they have capacity for faith, and that they can also be harnessed and summoned for a whole variety of sundry purposes for divinatory means, but also a variety of therapeutic and magical ends as well. And so this book of Felicity is truly a book of wonder in it, but wonder also applied, of like how to use the world for practical ends and how to take the unique properties and intermediary beings that populate a world truly enchanted with all variety of forces, and to deploy them for a set of purposes that are inherent within the natural world that just are waiting to be unlocked. Now, what's noteworthy about Sultan Murad III in this book of Felicity is he also commissioned at the same time a translation of a history of the New World. And this translation, it was circulated widely in Ottoman Turkish, and it drew upon Italian translations of Iberian accounts of the New World. So the Ottomans were very much not only a naval power of the Mediterranean and also of the Indian Ocean, but were very keenly aware of what was unfolding in the Atlantic and kept abreast of latest news around cartographical discoveries and information about new lands that were being uncovered. And this history of the New World, the Tarikh-i Dunya, as it's known in Turkish, was produced by the same courtier that produced this book of Felicity, this collection of talismanic and divinatory illuminated texts, is the same person who is also a navigator and a cartographer, and drawing upon classical cartography and classical accounts of the world, but in new modes. Now, as Isa highlighted, in Islamic maps, the south is often oriented toward the north, to the top, and that's what we have here. So if we flip this around for you, you can see how very, in a schematic form, this is the South America, Central America, and North America. It's also a space of not only mapping, but wonderment as well. And it's a book that's filled with details of strange creatures that now make their way westwardly. So here we have a detail of a merman who would be encountered in the Caribbean. And in this way, this is part of a larger paradigm of taking the classical marvels and rarities and strange creatures and strange populations and locating them ever more at the margins of new and uncovered territories. A parallel process unfolds in European cartography of the period. And in this way, the Ottomans were very much in keeping with the counterparts that were unfolding for the New World and European cartography and accounts of geography. Just to wrap up here, I wanted to say a few words about wonderment in the Islamic context. I mentioned this Qazvini, who has a book on natural history, his Wonders and Rarities, that, like John Mandeville or Marco Polo, circulated widely in Arabic and Persian and Turkish and Urdu as well. And he wrote extensively on the concept of wonder and the concept of rarity, which are the key categories for his collection. And at a philosophical level, these categories are rooted in forms of trying to understand the natural world. We're dealing not only with strange people at far-off lands, like we have here, people whose ears that are so large, the penote, as we heard, can wrap themselves up as blankets, or monopods in the middle, or people who live in trees, but also for mapping out things that were very much close at hand, that were strange and odd at hand and nearby, like rainbows or magnets or amber, or the unique properties of a whole set of common ingredients that you would find around an apothecary that could be used, as I've been noting, for therapeutic civic ends. And so the language of wonder is also a way of, in that relational sense, of engaging not only things far away, but things also potentially close at hand. These models of exchange that I've been highlighting between East and West, between the Islamic frameworks and the Christian counterparts in the Latin West were legible, even though they dealt with very different cosmologies and different senses of the world and its variation. These differences I'd be happy to get into in the question and answers. And that was pretty much all I wanted to share at this point. So I just want to thank you for including me in this conversation.
Thank you so much, Travis. That was fascinating. So we have some time now to